Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be adding some new jobs for the dwarves to do, as well as building upon the existing jobs visuals to get a better understanding of what's going on. So let's get right into it. Biggest problem I have with the state of the parts I made in the last video is that all of the interact animations were exactly the same. You're cutting down a tree, you're picking berries, you're dropping off items into storage. Didn't matter what they were doing, they'd always swing an axe at it. So I need a way to tell the animator to perform a different clip based on what it's doing, and what tool to use. My first thought was to use an animation override controller, and update this each time the unit switches jobs, but the thing with override controllers is they override every single animation, which is a little unnecessary. Second thought was just store an animation clip and override the state in code, but the biggest issue with this is accessing Unity's animation states in code is horrendously bad, as you can't really find one by name. Only the name of the current clip itself, which would always be changing, so that's out the window too. The solution I came up with instead is to create a new class called Interact Settings, which stores an enum for which type of animation to play, for example swinging a tool or gathering with their hands, and a string to say which tool to use, like an axe, hammer, or nothing. These settings are then added to each interact target and are read by the worker when their job target is updated. The enum is passed into the animator as an integer to switch between substate clips, and the tool is passed to a separate class which simply activates the tool with the correct name. Now, this may not be the most elegant way of doing things, I understand that, it's a little messy, but for this kind of project it's fine for the time being. If I run into any glaring issues in the future then I'll have to change it, but that's just not my concern at the moment. And here it is in action. You can see anytime he swaps jobs, the tool in his hand is changing, and the interact animation changes to better suit the target. You wouldn't gather berries by swinging a hatchet at them. Now that the animation system is in place for any job, it's time to start work on a brand new job type, the crafting stations. The idea here is that the dwarf will go to the station, interact with it to add progress to a bar, and when it's complete, turn the input materials into a new product. The first station I'm going to create is the woodcutter, which will turn wood logs that the gatherers collect into planks, which will then be a basic crafting material for other structures and recipes. So what are the key parts of the station? It will require an inventory, which is very easy to implement with the existing interface. It's an interact target, so again, it inherits that interface. It will need a float to track the progress, and it will need a list of recipes that it can produce. The first two of those are already done. The progress tracker is just a float that will count up on every interact, and then when it hits 100, reset and produce the output. The last part is the recipe, which is a new class that I'll create to store this data. The recipe will contain a list of resource stacks to say what is needed and how many, and then a single stack to define the output type and quantity. Now, the structure of the job site is exactly the same as the rest of the interact targets, so it's just a case of putting it together and seeing if it doesn't crash the game. So here we go, first test run. I just tell the dwarf to cut down some wood and set his drop-off point to the woodcutter. And he has no idea what's going on because he's trying to set both the gather target and the operate target to the building, which means he's just stuck between jobs constantly. So what I need to do is change the code that sets the targets so that if the player clicks the dwarf and then the building directly, it'll update the operator job. But if they click a resource first, that'll be gatherer. This way the selection system is context based and a bit more sophisticated, as targets can work with multiple jobs a bit easier. So how do I achieve this result? Well, instead of updating the job on every click, I just need to store the last click targets until something makes sense, and allow the player to revert selections if needed. If the player clicks on a resource node, the selection should wait for the player to click a location or inventory before updating their job. Now that that's been changed, let's have a look at him working away at the tree, and hopefully he starts to process the wood once it has enough resources. And there we go, he's now starting to work the job site, and you can see in the inspector it's removed some of the wood and now contains planks, a basic crafting material. That's working well, and if I go back and add a few more dwarfs into the game, you can see how it will work in a proper scenario, with one gathering wood and the other working on the woodcutter. It's all good that I've got these new building types in the game, but without any way of actually building them, they'd have to just be placed manually by me in the editor, and that's just no fun. Originally, how I had planned for this system to work is that the player would right-click an area to bring up the blueprints menu, showing off all of the available blueprints in that space. I programmed the first iteration of this system, had it all working, but in testing I just didn't like how it felt. The main theme with this game is to keep it all simple and have the dwarves work autonomously, which goes against this manual building system. So after spending a few hours making this, I decided it's for the best to scrap it for now. I don't want this game to just be another city builder, and instead lean more towards a colony sim, so adding the UI elements and these controls just didn't seem right. You'll get these feelings a lot when you develop games, and it's usually just for the best to sack off the work you've done, instead of trying to force it to fit. And now that that's been binned off, let's get version 2 going. And how that's going to work is that the dwarves will decide themselves what blueprint they'll build when certain conditions are met. For example, at the beginning of the game, once they've collected enough wood, they'll automatically decide to construct a woodcutter without direct input from the player. Once they have collected the wood, they'll place the building in a suitable position and the blueprints will work as originally planned. The dwarves will deliver the resources into the blueprint until they have enough to start construction, and then will work at it until it's complete. This system gives the dwarves a bit more autonomy and means that the player has to focus on balancing resource gathering more, which is the main aim of the game. Now the final thing I want to add is the world drops, the items. So when they're not stored in inventories, they can just be left on the floor ready for another dwarf to collect. So what needs to happen is the inventories have a drop resource function that instantiates a physical item at a specified location and removes it from the inventory. For this feature, the resources will need to store a model, so I just need to add that to the scriptable object, and then I'll need a new class for the item stack world, which will read this model and spawn it. This will be another interact target that the dwarves will interact with, and when it does, it simply adds the resource stack to their inventories and destroys the physical object. It's such a little feature, but now it allows the dwarves to gather resources and leave them in a pile for another dwarf to move into storage. And that is looking perfect. We've got the dwarves making progress now on their little towns, and I'll be expanding this next time with different recipes and resources which are very easy to add to the game with the scriptable objects in place. But that's going to do it for now. I'm really enjoying working on this project. It's just a bit of fun to think of something and see it come to life, and I hope you're enjoying this process. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.